So, Tanzania, a particularly interesting state, very interesting post-colonial trajectory, and increasingly more and more international attention. Politically speaking, it's a very good case for independence transition, a more peaceful African state relative to the regional context. Yet, on the other hand, also very high poverty levels and wavering economic performance. Located in a very strategic and geographical part of Africa on the east coast. So how do we understand Tanzania in the wider geopolitical and globalized context? Well, I'm very aware some of you will have a very good understanding of the country, but for the benefit of those who do not, I will have a quick sort of brief look at the historical context. I'll also look at the changing political context, look at the economic performance in the global economy, its leadership specifically, and what we can expect looking forward from 2017. But the crucial question, how did we get there? Well, Tanzania has gone through 5 key stages of post-independence governance, beginning with Julius Nyerere, who united the mainland with Zanzibar, bringing independence to the country. His aims were to eradicate corruption and bring solidarity and economic self-sufficiency. Interestingly, he was very critical of Western powers and brought a socialist movement to the country. But also importantly, he united the people under one political banner, unlike many other African states during the independence period, removing ethnicity from the equation, and which is key to its security stability during independence years. During the 80s, we see an opening of aid and accepting of IMF loans and payments. And then during the mid-90s and the early 2000s, introduction of multi-party politics. But also a deteriorating security situation around greater regional context, refugee inflows, but also the famous attack on the US Embassy in 1998. In the Kikwete years, Tanzania becomes more of a regional player. At the same time, there's more corruption, with his Prime Minister, Edward Lowassa, implicated in an external payment arrears scandal and famously resigned in 2008. And then in 2015 enters John Magufuli, a surprising candidate known for his ethical prominence, but also a tough stance on corruption. CCM puts the spotlight on him, the main political party, and successfully distances itself from corruption. So why is this important? Well, firstly, we see an increasingly corrupt stance taken by the ruling party, in spite of multi-party politics, elections, and democratic indicators. We see the internationalization of Tanzania since the Nyerere years, of Tanzanian politics, a movement from socialism to donor neo-patrimonial state, and the beginnings of a political marketplace. Thirdly, we also see a growing dissatisfaction with the ruling party, not only in Zanzibar, but also on the mainland. Important signs to note with the election in 2015 are that it's the most contested election in Tanzania's history, in independence history, with obviously the 58% majority there. But his opponent, Edward Lowassa, former Prime Minister with the Kikwete government, took nearly 40% of the vote. An interesting thought looking forward to the next election. Magufuli crucially wins on opportunistic policies. He promises to tackle corruption, raise the public revenue of the country, to improve the civil service performance, but also to cut the wasteful expenditure. Interestingly, from 2015 to 2017, we see a vast changing political context within Tanzania. We see a centralization of politics, the centralization of the budget, Magufuli's refusal to allow technocratic advice blur his vision of state-led industrialization, interestingly looking towards more than Nyerere years as well. We see this in specific examples in an overruling of his finance minister, Philip Mpango, and his reluctance and even dismissal of the civil service. Increasing political repression, keeping opposition MPs, for example, Arusha MP, God bless Lima, in detention since November 16, 2016, and a supposed witch hunt for those who speak out against the ruling party. Chairman of the opposition coalition, Chadema, Freeman Mbowe, has seen 3 of his businesses targeted by authorities in recent months. Perhaps more worryingly, we're seeing a banning of the free press and coercion on media. The opposition-owned press agencies have been closed. The media service at the moment is chaotic, with mainstream media treading very carefully, and yet on social media things are very much alive. It's clear that Magufuli is not afraid to use the courts and independent oversight agencies and new repressive legislation to silence political critics. So, John Magufuli, what are the prospects, uncertainties, and opportunities? Well, it's clear that he's an impulsive actor, and particularly anti-institutional. Interestingly, like I said before, going towards Nyerere days. He's very much a man of integrity through morality, a particularly dangerous cocktail for international politics. He has a firm executive and is absorbing public bodies. As I said, coercion on the public media. Unpredictable. The recent banning, the copper ban on acacia mining. Also the imprisonments, banning of an expatriate's passport in recent weeks, and sacking of dozens of members of the civil service. There seems to be no consistency with the CCM. They do not pursue sustainable political policies or sustainable development. But, as I alluded to previously, corruption is the main thing here. For example, the recent offer to Dangote for the coal offer, it's unlikely that it's done on its merits. In response, we're seeing an opposition coalition, Chadema, become more aggressive and rising up to the main party. Recently, the chairman of parliamentary trade within the CCM has stepped down with his deputy on yesterday, with reasons stating that he was visiting the imprisoned God Bless Lima in prison, with Magufuli's response as any CCM members who follow suit are saboteurs. Clearly this shows a constitutional crisis. It also illustrates Magufuli's unpredictable decision-making and a true lack of constitutional norms, which is leading to the destabilization across the board, from media, but also towards the mining industry and the basic freedoms of Tanzanians. In the macroeconomic context, things look a bit more favourable. Tanzania is showing strong GDP looking forward to 2017, with projections of around 7%. This is supported by growth in services in extractive industries, but also in its strengths in tourism and agriculture. Inflation remains positive with regard to this growth, sticking to the 5% target of the government. The balance of payments are slightly more worrying, which have been influenced by the global economy, commodity price shakes, and protectionism in the greater global context. But perhaps the most worrying aspect is the fiscal deficit, with around 4.5%. However, with large projected inflows of project loans and external non-concessional borrowing, this is expected to narrow in the upcoming months, years. And on the demographic scale, Tanzania has an increasingly young, growing population. So, looking forward, that's an interesting development for a large potential labour force. What are the opportunities and risks on the economic scale? Well, Magufuli's government is pursuing the second 5-year development plan, a particularly ambitious roadmap to change Tanzania towards middle income status as part of the Tanzania Development Division, a vision for 2025. This industrialization strategy relies on the country's comparative advantages, particularly in the agricultural sector with commodities such as tobacco, coffee, cotton and tea. Looking at the minerals, gold remains as 90% of its exports, but also there are diamonds, iron ore, among others. There's also a very large and young labour force. And of course, Tanzania's long coastline makes it an ideal trading partner, not just to the surrounding region, but to Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Looking at the risks, well, we have the immediate risks to the plan, and the outlook are mainly related to fiscal policy implementation. These include, firstly, weaker economic activity from a drop in exports, tight liquidity conditions, and a slow execution for the budget, linked to external financing shortfalls. There's also a prolonged slowdown in private sector growth, risking a general slowdown of economic growth, with the country in much needed injection into the economy. Tanzania, like many other countries, is also suffering from adverse effects from the international community, with international partners increasingly reluctant to invest in emerging markets, given the global economic uncertainty from the recent Brexit and Trump. So, main points looking forward with the macroeconomic focus. Well, Tanzania remains the second fastest growing economy in the East African community. Fiscal deficit is a big concern, with falls in projected aid flows, global financial market volatility. The government, looking forward, promises to increase revenues and to moderate government spending. In the wider geopolitical context, relations with Western partners have weakened as of late. This is directly linked to the state's unwillingness to address grand corruption, but also a more historical aspect of Tanzania's politics, which includes a deep ingrained distrust towards Western governments, but interestingly, opening with Chinese investment. For example, Tanzania's reluctance to sign the European Partnership Agreement, despite Kenya and other EAC members' signatures. Regionally, well, we see a competitiveness among the EAC community. Of course, the historic rivalry with Kenya, with Uganda shifting support between Kenya and Tanzania. But potential game changer with the Uganda-Tanzania pipeline scheduled for development in 2020. However, it's important to realise that this is by no means firm in place, and until it's signed off, nothing is certain. So what are the implications? Well, for stakeholders, government expenditure cutbacks will lead to a noticeable slowdown in economic activity. There's no liquidity in the market. Increasingly, there's an aggressive attitude towards certain investors. As I said before, the banning on Acacia, but also with firms like Symbion Power, Interenergy. Crucially, significant funding can only come from the private sector, and there must be infrastructure-driven growth. The World Bank has recently agreed to provide a $2.4 billion loan for infrastructure projects in Tanzania. From the energy side, it requires increasing improvement in the business environment. But also it's very important to take care with approach to the Magufuli government, to appreciate what they are trying to achieve with the budget, the increasing political repression against those who stand against the government. The main electricity supplier, TANESCO, continues to have a debt crisis. But also we see prospects in gas prospects. I think it's very important to frame your agendas to reflect the country's priorities. Perhaps also less obviously, to keep a close eye on civil society movements, as these are a particularly good indicator for political security looking forward. So, to summarise, well, Magufuli government is uncertain, it's pragmatic, unpredictable. Certainly an uncertain political future. There is confidence in the macroeconomic performance of Tanzania. It continues to be a strong economic performer regionally. But one should keep a close eye on its fiscal performance. Tanzania has its poor relations with Western partners, drawing back to the historic tendencies there. Yet, crucially, Magufuli is open to capitalism, unlike his previous predecessor, Nyerere, in the early 60s. Provided investors and stakeholders know these political risks and watch carefully, then there can be confidence looking forward in investing in Tanzania. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll now introduce Njoki to speak about Kenya and Uganda.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to speak to the state of politics, security, and the economy in Kenya and Uganda, and I'll longer probably focus on Kenya because it's my expertise. So probably if I'll start with the politics and security. And maybe just a short history on those who may not be that versed with Kenyan politics, in terms of where we are, because I'm focusing a lot on the geopolitics shaped by the current regime, Kenyatta II. So if we look, this is the fourth republic or the fourth regime. We've had Kenyatta I, who is Jomo Kenyatta, the father of the current president, Uhuru Kenyatta, whose probably regime was characterized by a very sharp economic growth. It was just soon after the colonial encounter, and shrinking political space, and also maybe one legacy that the Kenyatta I regime left that continues to impede politics and I think also the economy is failure to resolve what we call the land question in Kenya. So one of the main issues is lack of land reform, which came about, of course, from the colonial encounter. And the second regime, the Moi's dictatorship, and Moi reversed the economic growth that we witnessed through Kenyatta I. That's between 1978 to 2002. At the point, by the time Moi was living in 2002, the economy was growing, or rather not growing, but the economy was stunted at negative 0.2%. And so when Kibaki came, the first regime and the second, especially the first, Kibaki, 2002 to 2007, before the post-election violence, we had an economic growth of 8%, a lot of opening up of democratic space like never before, a lot of increased FDI. Kibaki believed in trickle-down economics, so infrastructure development, huge infrastructure development that I believe that's what Kenyatta II right now is still implementing. And of course, the post-election violence was one of the major setbacks of Kibaki's first regime. And so right now we are at Kenyatta II, Uhuru Kenyatta, who I would largely say is implementing Kibaki's projects, but some other, especially to do with huge infrastructure, but the other, of course, interesting projects that he brings about. So Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, so his deputy, were elected in the 2013, and they came in, of course, as selling themselves as this young digital group, and they're so their selling point really was their youthfulness, and also like a group that is going to help Kenya assert its sovereignty, because they had been indicted by the ICC. But also because we had passed a new constitution that had been inaugurated in 2010. So in 2013, that's when the implementation of the new constitution started. And so one of the successes or good things in the new constitution was to decentralize power. So the three regimes I've talked about earlier, one of the main, when we had the violence in 2007, one of the main issues that needed to be addressed to prevent violence in the future is how to reduce the powers of the presidency, address land issues, devolve also government from the center. So devolution, the challenge is also there's a very high reliance. It's quite costly to implement devolution. It relied heavily, I think, on the U.S. federal system, but it's almost like there's a lot of successes, but also many challenges in its implementation. So that 2010 constitution is considered one of the most progressive in Africa, together with the South African constitution. So there's a lot of hope in that if you have the right people implementing, I think that constitution in the future, in terms of Kenya moving forward or politically, it's going to be a very it's going to be important in advancing. So, but there's yet very little progress made so far in translating that constitution to the norms and culture and behavior. This is the one constitution in Africa, and I believe the rest of the world, where there's actually a chapter devoted to integrity and ethics, and how to prevent leaders who don't follow, who fall behind on integrity, and there are all these checks. Implementation, of course, is something else, but it is there, and I doubt there are other constitutions in the world with such a chapter that is speaking explicitly to how to address integrity. The challenges that continue to impede Kenya politically, and this is probably a political risk, is still, especially within the current regime, there's strengthening again of ethnic-based divisions, which come from the previous, that history of division, and so there's increased silencing of the media, increased shrinking of the political space compared to Kibaki, where we were coming from Moi, and then suddenly there was increased political. So Kenyatta is rolling back, and largely after the ICC, there was a lot of antagonism, especially between Kenyatta's regime and civil society, and anybody who seems to believe in free media. So civil society and free speech have kind of are shrinking, but again, because of the constitution, that constitution, which is very progressive, there's also a lot of pushback from parliament or from civil society groups. In terms of security, I think there's what we call a form of community policing that, for those who, on one side, it's seen as it's a very progressive, especially with the new what they call CVE, counterterrorism, and also many other security implications. But on to its critiques, they believe this whole community policing, also known as Nyumba Kumi, is more about spying on the enemy. So there's debate around that. There's also the encouraging of this notion as development as only possible if you're supporting the party in power. Of course, in terms of on the ground, that's really, because there's now a devolved government, there's a lot of money that has gone into devolved government. So this is, but on this does it in terms of implementation, of course. But you can see a lot of the government asking people join us and then this will happen to you. But again, as I said, the 2010 constitution is helping to push back on that. There's of course increased, as I said, animosity on civil society, still corruption. In terms of state of security, there's increased militarization. I think similar to what we will see in Uganda. Uganda, I think this has been quite a constant, but in Kenya, coming from regimes that there was quite a thin line, not a thin line, but a quite separate, the state and the security apparatus. We see a lot of Uhuru Kenyatta now asserting his role as the commander-in-chief, wearing military fatigues, and so there's a lot of that. Of course, some of the main security challenges, Al-Shabaab continues to be one of the main security challenges, especially in the northeastern region and the coasts. So that continues to be a security challenge that is still, but again, there's a lot of increased surveillance, increased intelligence. I think it's still much better than maybe 2013 when we had the big Westgate attack. And the challenge with also security terrorist attacks is because there's a lot of margin of the grievances that exist. So ethnic, generational, and religious kind of people who are marginalized around all those issues. So youth, male youth or young women, but of course it's mostly male youth. And so their grievances seem to be amplified, and all these come together. And then if there's also high levels of corruption within the security forces, it's very easy then to infiltrate. So this continues to be a major security challenge that poses a lot of risks in terms of even politics or the economy. So, and then the challenge we have is also the government seems to target the same marginalized communities in a way that, like, for instance, the Somali, ethnic Somali, or many young men in the coast. So there's kind of now a self-fulfilling pattern between the government and these marginalized groups, so further entrenching those perceptions of exclusion. Crime rates, I think, connected with corruption. I think I've talked about that. But again, as I said, the new constitution is doing a lot because there's devolved government, so there's increased oversight from devolved governments, because part of security, as much as there's still a bit of overlaps and gaps, has been devolved to there's better oversight. There's also these oversight bodies like IPOA, which is the police oversight authority. So this kind of addressing. And in terms of security, I believe also security is not just hardcore security. So health is a security issue. Food insecurity is a security issue if we talk about within the realm of human security. So this continue to kind of also impede. They continue to become a security risk. The cost of disease burden in Kenya is quite high. The doctors have been on strike for about 100 days. The cancer burden is increasing. There's still not enough in terms of what the government is investing. Food insecurity, I think, continues to also impede that, and you have seen the recent appeal, I think, for farming in East Africa and Kenya specifically. So in terms of economics and the likely investment on politics and investment, so there are several factors still that continue to impede growth. So from 2013 to 2017, so we are going into elections this year in August. So growth really is from huge infrastructural projects. I think most of them launched during Kibaki. The SGR is the Standard Gauge Railway between Nairobi and Mombasa, and the LAPSSET program is a pipelines to through from Kenya to Sudan, and initially we had also Ethiopia involved in this, and Uganda, but there's still, but I think Kenya is doing its part. I'll show a map there. So in terms of growth, we average, in terms of economic growth, I think we averaged at 5.9% in 2016, 6% 2017. So there's growth, but it's growth from a lot of infrastructure. Still, it's yet to trickle down in terms of ordinary people. So Chinese constructed SGR completion is slotted for 2016 and is likely to reduce time in movement of goods and people between Nairobi and Mombasa. This is likely to be a game changer. So in the next few months, in terms of trade, in terms of movement of goods and people, and I mean this is because we've had the rail that was still constructed by the British in I think 1906 or something. So this is going to change things drastically. So there's still continues to be chronic budget deficits, of course, because of this huge infrastructural projects, and there's continued borrowing and less funds for poor development projects, whether it's housing, whether it's agriculture sector. So agriculture continues to still be the biggest contributor to GDP. According to the World Bank, that's at 25%. There's still a lot of investment in agriculture needed. The tourism sector is improving despite the multiple attacks, small around the northeastern region, I think, but the biggest attack was in 2013. The high wage bill among the elites is still a threat to labor relations, which, like for instance, as I was saying, the doctors have been on strike for quite some time, and lecturers, but they've just gone back. So so unless the wage bill also, and that's what I was talking about, the cost of devolution, implementing a system that is still very costly, as much as it's still a very good thing, and you have seen some of the advantages of this constitution, and the increasing inequality gap between there's a large growing middle class elite in Nairobi, not just in Nairobi, but in Kenya generally, who are taking advantage of all this economic progress, but still a lot of inequality, increasing inequality, I think, as all economies that are about to take off. But I think a lot of work needs to be done to create programs that address youth unemployment. The median Kenyan is 18 years, so there are lots of young people, again, without employment, and that poses a lot of risks to political stability. So Kenya is still attracting blue chip companies. So many companies have moved in, whether it's IBM, General Electric. So many companies are moving into Kenya to take advantage of Kenya is, of course, in Africa right now, the leading in terms of technological innovations. I don't know whether you've heard of M-Pesa, the money transfer program where you do business on your phone, which is one leading innovation, I think, also from Kenya that many people are trying to replicate elsewhere. So it's leading in mobile banking, mobile technology, and many other technologies, renewable energy. We had the conference the entrepreneurship conference that Obama attended, I think last year in July. So this has also spurred a lot of interest in renewable energy and all entrepreneurship around the two areas, and many others, and many U.S. companies have moved to Kenya after that. So in terms of technology, also the laptop per child program, I think, is the one main big program that the current regime is trying or has tried implementing. So this is also, in the future, this is likely to have a huge impact in terms of the competitiveness of youth. So this is the SGLR that is almost in completion on your left, and the map is the LAPSSET program. So the pipeline, the oil pipeline, and all it's going to be like a transport corridor that is also in the process. And you can see the Moyale route goes to Ethiopia, and the other was it's going to South Sudan. So opening up the region, and most of northern Kenya, because of it's from the British to the post-colonial times, it's been largely undeveloped. So this is tapping a lot on northern Kenya, and there's lots of opportunities. So looking at the elections this year, and in terms of political risk, or what is the outlook? So we have, it's mainly going to be what in Kenya we say two-horse race. So these are the two main coalitions, Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto on one side, and Raila Odinga, Kalonzo, and Musalia on the other, NASA. So it's the NASA coalition. So that's the incumbents, of course, is Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto. Most politics is still around ethnic coalitions. So of course, there's a Kenyan political scientist who coined something called the tyranny of numbers. So that seems to still be shaping around, the politics seems to be shaping around numbers, who has which numbers. So there's increased tension ahead of elections, following, of course, the political theatrics of politicians. So I said the elections are in August this year. Widespread violence unlikely after 2007. Maybe I have too much hope in the Constitution. But also, I think the opposition, after what happened, because Raila Odinga was still in the opposition then, there is not likely to I think many people have become violence averse after what happened. So, but there is going to be likely low intensity riots in especially some of those cosmopolitan spaces where different either ethnic groups or different people who believe in different parties kind of coalesce. So a strong opposition that now also respects the Kenyan judiciary. There was judiciary reforms that took place after the election. So that is likely to also prevent any kind of violence, because people are starting to believe in institutions. The Kenyan society, civil society, despite the shrinking space and a lot of animosity from the government, I think they remain quite vigilant. LAPSSET transport corridor is likely to transform the region. The high wage bill, the elite wage bill, whether it's in implementing devolution and also at the central government, the strikes are likely to continue unless the high is harmonized. And we had maybe a week ago, Kenyatta have a state of union. It's like a state of union, but it's really it's talking. And these are some of the issues he highlighted. I hope he implements them. High debts, there's huge debt, I think, incurred, of course, through these huge infrastructural projects. FDI investments that favor the rising middle class are going to increase, of course, with increasing income inequalities. And that's the problem, because the more we have income inequalities, many young people without employment, then political risks are very real. So. And also in political instability. So there's need for innovative, for instance, low-income housing, food security, investment, and all this investment, and just employment, labor-intensive or whatever, employment for many youth. So devolution challenges, especially in healthcare, security, and extractives to continue. For instance, what we have seen in Turkana between now the central government and the local government. Al-Shabaab, security threats on the Somali border, northeastern. So unless also the government, as much as they seem to be doing a lot, but unless they also address corruption in the security forces, and also probably move out of Somalia, this is likely to happen, because they are all, anyway, there's a whole presentation on Al-Shabaab, Somalia elites and what's going on. And then increasing ethnic galvanizing, and the challenge of building a cohesive nation state will continue. As I said, the land question, as much as if Kenyatta does not resolve the sins of his father, building a cohesive nation state in Kenya continues to be a big problem. So hate speech and singling out of traitors likely to increase. And I think that's the end of the Kenyan presentation. I'll do a quick run through of Uganda. So Uganda, Museveni, Museveni, of course, as many of you know, has been there since 1986, and many Ugandan scholars call his politics movementocracy. So the movement, because he came in and said, the NRM, the National Resistance Movement. So the movement and the state, there's a very thin line between the movement and the state. And so it's defined by patronage, corruption, and increased militarism funded by external development partners. So increased donor funding of security in 2001. During the Lord's resistance movement, the conflicts in the north strengthened Museveni's power and militarized the state, because most of the money went into helping Museveni fight LRA, and it was seen as important because of the geopolitics of the region. South Sudan that time was also not stable enough, and so Museveni became like the security philanthropist, as some colleagues calls him. So increased, so that has created a very militarized state. So from the outside, and also Museveni is of course wanting to crush his own opposition, and so it's a very interesting dynamic. So in February last year, 2016, there was another election in which Museveni won 60% of the vote, of course with Kiza Besigye at 35 and Amama Bambazi at 1.4. So the election was characterized by intimidation and arrest of, I'm sure you saw a lot of Kiza all the time in the media being arrested. Arrest of opposition politicians meant to limit opportunities for them to campaign. So Museveni's centralized power is problematic, but has created, strangely, or it's a contradiction, has created a more stable Uganda if you compare it to Kenya. Uganda has been able to address terrorist threats and crime prevention much better than Kenya. If you see, since the attack in the restaurant quite a couple of years ago, I think near Christmas, 4 or 5 years ago, we've not had any terror attacks, and yet AMISOM, or most of the Uganda has many of its forces in Somalia, but in Kenya it's quite so I think in terms of stability and security, and speaking also into Uganda becoming a security philanthropist, I think that's what I was talking about earlier, and how external, especially I think the British government funds, DFI funds a lot of that, and the US, which is problematic on one side because that power that he now has because of the increased military and funding, also he uses it to oppress his own opposition and maintain his own power and also on the other hand you can see, because of he's been there's also a lot of stability, so it's a bit of a contradiction. So Museveni's strategic relevance, as I was saying, provides him with that security funding for CVE, violent counter-terror. So 70% of this is on the economy, is based on government activity. So that's also quite problematic. I think the Kenyan government probably is doing better on that, but still. So there's also a rising national debt. Uganda currently owes over $6 billion, and the debt of GDP to ratio is still low, quite alarming. And then the Kabale-Tanga route. So I think, and Tom talked about how Tanzania has been able to benefit from Uganda changing tact. So Uganda now is more aligned to Tanzania in terms of the geopolitics in the region. So this, initially the LAPSSET, not LAPSSET, but the SGLR in Kenya was meant to be something that Uganda would complete their side of the train, and also I think part of the LAPSSET program, but they have recently gone to Tanzania with the Kabale-Tanga route, so for petroleum and transport, and the first oil export is expected in mid-2020. So Tanzania's land policy, where government owns all the land, I think is providing a competitive edge to Kenya's private land ownership. Again, the land question in Kenya. Youth bulge crisis, Uganda's median population is 15.8. So a very young population, I think 16 years, 48% of the population is 16 years. So in terms of demographics, there's a lot of opportunity, but also there's a lot of risk if the government doesn't address issues like the politics and to ensure that youth employment is addressed. So investments, of course, in gold and oil, agriculture is ongoing, but there's still a lack of inclusive and coherent coordination that can maximize their production. But I think they still, because again of Museveni's centrality and maybe dictatorial tendencies, they seem to still have a more harmonized plan compared to Kenya. So in terms of outlook, the denial of fundamental freedoms of association is likely to continue with Museveni's leadership. Now that he just got into power last year, so he's going to be there again, I can imagine, for a few more years. So reduced powers of the presidency and the relationship between the state and the military has still yet to be addressed. And so it should be addressed in the reform of the Electoral Commission that got him back to power. The Muhoozi project. Muhoozi is Museveni's son, who's been promoted in the military, and there are rumors that he's likely to he's been promoted to become the next president. Because one of the things Museveni has been quite successful in is because of the military and the loyalty. So this might spark division in the military, I don't know, but that's what many scholars and critics are saying. Uganda's development partners need to find a balance between supporting effective leadership and development and security on one side and stability, and also supporting the democratic project or to start, because it was, Museveni came in as the most democratic, the most progressive leader in 1986, but he has become something else. So management of federalist demands also, that's likely to pose other political risks. So there are many kingdoms in Uganda. So managing that equitably among the kingdoms and between the central government, that also brings a bit of conflict. Implementation of anti-corruption reforms and rebuilding trust is also going to be important moving forward. Unemployment, lack of affordable higher education and better opportunities may increase popular unrests. And you can see the population is very young, 48% is less than 16 years, may increase popular unrest as Museveni continues to suppress either riots or any forms of contestations by authoritarian means. So that's the end of the presentation, and I thank you for your listening.